So a few days ago we talked about the Spanish flu and how it wasn't really a Spanish flu but more like the Fort Riley flu. And we talked about how they deemed it an influenza, but they've never really been able to synthesize the specific influenza that they think it was, which they think it was a type of swine flu. What we didn't talk about was when swine flu came back up in the 70's. And 60 Minutes even covered it, and they had a very interesting take on what had happened when the government decided that it was going to do mass vaccinations. The government just used people's names who hadn't even had vaccinations, people like Mary Tyler Moore. Other famous people like Elton John, who amazingly was used to push this first swine flu vaccine in 1976, and yet again in 2020 is putting out the coronavirus information, we'll call it. Just told everyone they took the swine flu vaccination and it was in everyone's best interest. These were the gatekeepers of the time. And the people that I showed you at the intro of this video, these are the gatekeepers of our time, telling us, little civilians, what it is that we should be doing and how we should be acting. I find it hilarious, though, that 60 Minutes tracked this down and actually asked Mary Tyler Moore, did you ever get the swine flu shot? Listen to the response. Listen to the similarities between what happened at Fort Dix in New Jersey and we went over what happened at Fort Riley, because there's similarities there that speak to the same kind of testing maybe had been going on at Fort Dix. Vaccination testing that we never found out about. But it's very interesting the panic that happened and the decision to vaccinate. Because the decision to vaccinate inevitably hurt more people than their essentially imagined swine flu. Don't worry, we're going to go over it. First, let's hear the 60 Minutes.
Planning the campaign to urge Americans to take the shot. The swine flu vaccine has been taken by many important persons, he wrote. Example, President Ford, Henry Kissinger, Elton John, Muhammad Ali, Mary Tyler Moore, Rudolph Nureyev, Walter Cronkite, Ralph Nader, Edward Kennedy, etc., etc. Mary, did you take a swine flu shot?
No, I did not.
Did you give them permission to use your name saying that you had or were going to?
Absolutely not. Never did.
Dr. David Sencer, then head of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, is now in private industry. He devised the swine flu program, and he pushed it. Where did this so-called deadly variety of flu, where did it first hit back in 1976? It began right here at Fort Dix in New Jersey in January of that year, when a number of recruits began to complain of respiratory ailments, something like the common cold. An Army doctor here sent samples of their throat cultures to the New Jersey Public Health Lab to find out just what kind of bug was going around here. One of those samples was from a Private David Lewis who had left his sickbed to go on a forced march. Private Lewis had collapsed on that march, and his sergeant had revived him by mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. But the sergeant showed no signs of illness. A few days later, Private Lewis died. The New Jersey lab identified most of those soldiers' throat cultures as the normal kind of flu virus going around that year, but they could not make out what kind of virus was in the culture from the dead soldier and from 4 others who were sick. So they sent those cultures to the Federal Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, for further study. A few days later, they got the verdict: swine flu. But that much publicized outbreak of swine flu at Fort Dix involved only Private Lewis, who died, and those 4 other soldiers who recovered completely without the swine flu shot.
If I had known at that time that the boy had been in a sick bed, got up, went out on a forced march, and then collapsed and died, I would never have taken the shot.
Okay, let's start with an article from Maclean's that is written on May 17th, 1976, right in the middle of all this going down. Let's see how the media is portraying the CDC, the WHO, the people who are supposedly in charge, the people who inevitably pushed a vaccine onto the population over this that killed more people than the actual flu that they were shooting at. Let's read the propaganda of the time. The politics of swine flu. In 1918 and 1919, swine flu killed 21 million people. False. They have not been able to synthesize the virus that killed so many people in 1918, 1919 that has been labeled the Spanish influenza, even though it should be labeled the Fort Riley influenza. They are guessing that it's swine flu, but they have not proven that. But in 1976, they knew that for a fact, obviously. In a few months, it may be back, but this time, we're ready for it. We're not ready for it now, but in 1976 they were. The human sneeze has a muzzle velocity of 152 feet per second. It can send a spray of 4,600 particles into the air for a distance of 12 feet. The particles can suspend in the air for as long as half an hour. Each particle can contain 19,000 bacteria colonies, and together more than 85 million bacteria. The human sneeze is the most common form of the transmission of infectious influenza from one person to another. The opening paragraph makes the human sneeze like it's a weapon of mass destruction. And I mean, I guess they're saying that now. The when? May 17th, 1976. The where? Fort Dix, New Jersey. It's a rambling collection of army buildings about a 40-minute drive from downtown Philadelphia. It provides a 7-week basic combat training course for raw recruits from the eastern seaboard of the United States. It used to back in 1976. It no longer has basic training, but it does have a MEPS there so that you can join the army there, and it's also got a prison. Yay, federal prison. Anyways, at any one time, it contains a base population of about 21,000 Army and civilian personnel. By early February this year, David Lewis was in his 3rd week of the training course. He was from Ashley Falls, Massachusetts, and 19 years old. On February 3rd, Private Lewis, Echo Company, 3rd Basic Combat Training Brigade, presented himself to the base dispensary during the daily sick call. He complained of a general soreness, some nausea, and a temperature of 100.4. He was ordered to confined to quarters for 48 hours, but the next day, February 4th, he left his barracks and joined his platoon for M16 rifle drill on the post range. On the march back to the barracks, he collapsed and was taken to the base hospital where he died between 7:30 p.m. and 7:45 p.m. Because there had been a high incidence of flu at Fort Dix, and because of the manner of Lewis's death, an autopsy was performed by the chief of the hospital's pathology department, Dr. John Zabkar. He reported his findings to Colonel Joseph Bartley, the Assistant Director of Health and Environment Activities at Fort Dix, the next day. The autopsy showed that Private Lewis had died of pure viral pneumonia caused by influenza. Traces of the strain were found in his trachea and were isolated in lung tissue. While some 300 recruits had come down with the flu on their return from Christmas leave, Lewis was the only fatality. Fort Dix medical teams took throat washings from all recruits suffering from flu and sent them to New Jersey State Public Health Laboratory for identification. Dr. Martin Goldfield, a state immunologist, began testing the strains from Fort Dix against the regions he had on hand at his laboratory. A virus known as A. Victoria 75, named because it had first been isolated in Australia, had been the most common flu strain infecting Canadians and Americans over that winter. Dr. Goldfield isolated 4 new strains from Fort Dix through a procedure called a complement fixation test. So listen to what they're saying there. The common flu A, that had been affecting most people, was not what these guys had. One of the strains was the swine flu, and there were 3 other new strains that this article does not mention that came out of Fort Dix at that time. Now, what does that tell you about a possible vaccination program that was going on inside of Fort Dix at that time? This guy synthesizes the samples from some 200 soldiers at Fort Dix, and he finds 4 new unidentified influenza strains coming out of the same base. One of them being swine flu. He was able to determine that it was the type of virus called influenza A, but it was not A Victoria. This A virus was something completely new to him. He immediately called Dr. Walter Dowdle of the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. Later, the Fort Dix strains were hand-carried to the CDC for identification by Dr. Dowdle. On Friday, February 13th, Colonel Philip Russell was looking forward to a weekend of skiing in Maryland, Massachusetts. He had bought a new pair of ski boots and some expensive Kinesio skis. I should probably know that name. They're probably expensive. What a beautiful picture this writer's painting right now. Colonel Russell getting ready to go out. Honey, did you grab my fresh Kinesio skis? No, I don't think I did. Well, get them, please. I'm looking forward to a weekend of skiing in the Maryland mountains. His wife was to pick him up at his office at Washington's Walter Reed Institute of Research, where he is the director of the Division of Communicable Diseases and Immunology. A tall, spare man, Russell is an internist with a specialty in tropical diseases. He went to Johns Hopkins Medical School and the University of Rochester and has spent much of his career in the tropics. Before he could leave his office for the ski hills, he got a call from Dr. Dowdle in Atlanta. After a few pleasantries, Dowdle asked, "What the heck is going on up at Fort Dix?" "I don't know, Walt. Apparently they've had a bump of their ARD, acute respiratory disease, rates." "Well, we've got something here," Dowdle said. Russell slammed the phone down and turned to his wife. He told her to start for the mountains without him and grab the next plane to Atlanta. The next morning, February 14th, Valentine's Day, he met with Dr. Dowdle at CDC. At the meeting were Dr. David Sensor. Now listen, Dr. David Sensor is the fall guy that later gets in trouble for all this and gets fired from the CDC. So keep that name in mind, even though it's spelled incorrectly. At the meeting, Dr. David Sensor, the director of CDC, Dr. Goldfield, CDC staff immunologist, and officials of the Federal Bureau of Biologies, the department responsible for overseeing the production of various vaccines. Dr. Dowdle presented his data, and the strain was identified for the first time as A. Swine FU Dix 76. Swine influenza, hog flu. The same strain of influenza blamed for the pandemic of 1918-1919, blamed, which tore through every country of the world, killing more than 21 million people. Russell immediately flew back to Washington. His job was to field a number of medical teams at Fort Dix to track down the recruits from whom the original throat washings had been taken. He wanted to get antibodies from them to see if they reacted with the A swine. He activated a special operation in military jargon called EPICON, the Epidemiologic Consultation Service, including a team of trained epidemiologists backed up by the Infectious Disease Laboratory, the Department of Virus Diseases, and the Health and Environment branches of the Surgeon General's office. What a bunch of garbage. They had to find out how far the infection had spread. Each man had his job. Russell was responsible for determining the spread of the disease on post. Goldfield was concerned about the state of New Jersey, while Dowdle was worried about the entire rest of the country. For the next few weeks, Russell's people worked 7 days a week, existing on 3 or 4 hours of sleep at night. Teams of officers and enlisted medics at Fort Dix monitored incoming patients at the base hospital. They took blood samples from whole platoons between 40 and 50 men. They carried out a full SARA epidemiological study of the base, taking 10% sample of the entire population, including the Army band, of all things. There was a feeling of urgency. You don't mess with the Army band unless there's a feeling of urgency, but not panic. The last thing the doctors wanted was any hint of wildfire and instantaneous spread of deadly disease throughout the United States. They were simply well-trained professionals doing their job. And what did these well-trained professionals doing their job decide to do? Well, off of one case of fatal swine flu, and 14 cases of non-fatal, fully recovered swine flu, they decided to enact a full-spectrum vaccination program. But it didn't just start in the USA. The first man in Canada to learn of swine was Dr. J.D. Abbott of the Laboratory Center for Disease Control and Ministry of National Health and Welfare in Ottawa. Dr. Abbott talks to Dr. Sensor once or twice a week about the prevalence of communicable diseases. In November, the two had talked about the virulence. I have trouble with that word. About the virulence of Victoria, which was coming into Canada. After Dr. Sensor told Dr. Abbott about swine isolates from Fort Dix, Abbott called his chief, Dr. Alex Morrison. The two decided to call an emergency meeting of a group called the National Advisory Committee on Immunizing Agents. This 12-member committee meets from time to study the incidence of communicable diseases in Canada and makes recommendations to the government health authorities. Its chairman, Dr. J.M.S. Dixon of the University of Alberta and director of Provincial Laboratory of Public Health, Dixon and others were contacted and arrangements were made for the emergency meeting in the boardroom of the Laboratory for Disease Control at Tooney's Pasture in Ottawa. They knew the Americans were thinking of mass inoculation against swine flu. Isn't it insane how this article in 1976 is just packed with so much bureaucratic jargon that it's even hard to understand what is happening? They're activating all these things like the Laboratory for Disease Control, Dr. J.M.S. Dixon from Alberta, the University of Alberta, and the National Advisory Committee on Immunizing Agents. This is just in Canada. We just got done reading all the other bureaucracy in the American part further up. It's insane. It's almost like a way of hiding that they didn't do anything except suggest a horrible vaccination program. The decision for mass inoculation had to be a political one based on the advice of experts in the preventative medicine in both countries. On March 23rd, the National Advisory Committee met all day in Ottawa. At the same time in Washington, the Immunization Practices Advisory Committee was hearing reports from the people at the CDC and renowned immunologists from across the country. On Wednesday, March 24th, President Gerald Ford announced a universal vaccination program for all Americans. It was the largest such program ever undertaken. It would cost $135 million. And because it is an election year, let me say that again, because it was an election year, Ford was immediately accused of playing politics with scare tactics about an epidemic come November. Because it was an election year. Privately, U.S. medical officials were sorry the announcement had not come from the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare instead of the Oval Office. Officials at the WHO in Geneva expressed surprise at the suddenness of Ford's decision, particularly when there was no evidence of any spread of the virus from Fort Dix to general population. Less than a month later, a special meeting of WHO experts in Geneva would advise every country in the world to prepare for the possibility of an epidemic of swine flu next autumn. In Canada, Health Minister Marc Lalonde studied the recommendation of his advisory committee. In each province, medical officers of health had been alerted to the possibility of a new strain of flu and were told to report any new strains in the areas. 6 days after the Ford announcement, Health Minister Lalonde rose in the Commons to announce a program of inoculation for 11.6 million Canadians at a probable cost of $70 million. What vaccine we couldn't make ourselves, Lalonde said, we could buy from the Americans. Look at the reality of what happened several years later, because again, that article I just read to you was from 1976 while everything was going down. It was all puff. And you could tell it now, looking back. Here's an article from much later, and it's covering the guy who they barely mentioned in that puff piece. And his name is David Sensor. In 1976, officials responded with vaccination that killed more people than the flu it cost. Dr. David Sensor, his job at Centers for Disease Control Director, Sensor says officials, quote, believed that we were doing the right thing, close quote. The man who led the response to the 1976 swine flu outbreak is defending the vaccination campaign that led to more deaths than the disease, but says he's sorry for the people killed or sickened. Dr. David Sencer says with today's knowledge, officials in 1976 recommendations would have been different. Federal officials urged widespread vaccinations after swine flu broke out among soldiers at Fort Dix, New Jersey, killing 1 of the 14 diagnosed with the illness. But the program had suspended after at least 25 people died from the vaccine reactions. Other estimates put the death toll at 32, while about 500 others later suffered Guillain-Barré syndrome, which damages nerves and can lead to paralysis. Results cost David Sencer his job as director for CDC and prevention. He was fired in 1977 after 11 years on the job. Now 84 and retired, he said this week that health officials acted on the best knowledge that we had and believed that we were doing the right thing. But he added, "We know a lot more about viruses than we did then. If we were faced with what we had in 1976 today, where it was limited only to Fort Dix, we probably would not have recommended a universal vaccination until we saw spread outside of Fort Dix," he said. In the aftermath, the government was criticized for pushing Americans to get unnecessary vaccinations, but we also have to feel if we didn't do something and swine flu spread, more people would have died. Asked about those hurt by the vaccine, he said, "If you're not sorry, you're not a human being." But he said the government paid settlements to those hurt people, so that we tried to at least make reparations in that standpoint. So there you have it. They had a few cases at Fort Dix pop up. They, quote, identified a new type of influenza. They claim 14 people had that new type of influenza, and one of them died from it, and the other 14 got better. And yet they used it to justify a mass inoculation program that killed more people than the influenza at Fort Dix. This was just as recently as 1976, and you saw what they were doing to promote people getting the vaccination. They were lying, saying that people like Mary Tyler Moore had gotten this vaccine. This vaccine that injured more people than it saved. Do we understand what I'm saying here? Are y'all picking up what I'm putting down? Even getting into autism and vaccine injury. But just between the Fort Riley flu that killed millions of people in 1918, 1919, known as the Spanish flu, just as this episode of swine flu, it seems that our government has zero problems politicizing these situations and using them to their advantage. The swine flu was one case, one death, one person died. And the article we read said that 14 people were infected other than the person who died, but the 60 Minutes coverage said that it was only 4 other people. Either way, whether it was a total of 15 or 5, it precipitated bills being passed in the House of Commons in Canada and in the House of Congress in America to inoculate tens of millions of people with a vaccine that ended up causing severe vaccine injuries to the people who they first started giving it to the point where they had to shut it down. All this because Gerald Ford got wind of the information and used it in an election cycle. Is any of this seeming familiar? I don't know if this time around it's so much about the vaccine. It seems to me with the PR terms, and we've talked about the PR terms like social distancing and self-quarantining, terms like panic buying. It seems like this time around it's a preparation for medical martial law or regular martial law. All of the gatekeepers that I showed you that are claiming to be sick, they're just self-isolating, being good little citizens and telling us it's not too horrible. You play your Xbox and you watch your TV and you enjoy your family and you just stay inside and be a good little citizen. And that seems to be the message that the gatekeepers are putting out there. In the meantime, businesses are closed. The airline industry is stopped. Unless there's a separate financial system set up where we can get rid of this Fed system. We have to get out of this Fed system. But if you take anything away from this video, just know they've politicized viruses in the past during election cycles to influence the outcomes of the elections, and it's had negative consequences on Americans for a very long time. Like, share, subscribe. Listen, guys, I put my PayPal in there. I want to try to grow this channel. More than anything you can do for me, you give me a thumbs up, you share this video somewhere, you make a comment. It helps me get into the algorithms. If you think I'm doing a halfway decent job and you want my content to get out there, that's the only way it's going to happen. I really appreciate all 143 subscribers I think I had the last time I checked. I love all y'all. Stick with me. We will continue to look behind the news, look through the propaganda, because we are the news now. I also have a Discord that I'm going to start putting a link to in my descriptions. I encourage you guys to join the Discord so we can share intelligence. The ultimate goal for my channel would be to have a good group of guys and girls that can do research on their own time, and we can actually at a certain point make a difference and get real truth out to people. I created a BitChute account. I'm going to put a link to that because eventually it's going to all have to move to BitChute. And if you guys don't see the writing on the wall there, well, I told you, it's going to all move to BitChute. But thanks for listening, and I'll have another video out tomorrow since, hey, I can't go to work. The government shut down my job. Like, share, subscribe. Thanks, guys.